All right, so I am back once again, and I'm doing a little bit of review on some of the light meters I own and have covered. I've kind of talked about a few of these in the past, but I just wanted to go over it and give some updates and some things I've learned about them. The first one I'm going over is not really that important. This is a PentaView meter made by Sportron, I think. I actually got this in a consignment of stuff I bought relatively cheap, and this is probably from the 70s. It's a very solidly built light meter. It's got the little viewfinder, so it's a, I think it's a reflected light meter, or a spot meter, I guess would be the more accurate term. And it uses a couple of LR44 batteries. It's a pretty neat little meter. I like it. This is the only spot meter where you actually have the viewfinder I've ever owned, and I find that pretty interesting. I don't know how easy these are to find. I've seen a couple on eBay, but they're kind of expensive. But this is a neat little one I picked up that has worked just fine. It even had corroded batteries in here, and I managed to put a little acid in there and kind of pick them out and clean out the little battery compartment. It worked just fine. So they're probably a little more resilient than a lot of the modern stuff you're using. And they are using LR44 batteries. There's 2 of them in there, and it seems to work very well with them. So that's just a neat little one I picked up. I don't know how easy that one would be to find, but if you can find one out there, I would definitely say, especially if it's a good price, like less than $100, give it a try. So next up, I have the Syonic right here. I've talked about this one some. I like it. I recently, or not too long ago, I popped off that little, the white, I forget what it's called, but that little incident thing that you flip over to make it like a meter you face at the light, and it tells you what the received light is rather than the reflected light. That kept getting in the way. I hated it. I never used it, so I just popped it off. I've had this meter for probably about 7 years, and it has worked pretty darn well. I think the exposures are pretty accurate. One thing I do notice is sometimes you have to kind of like move it around and get multiple meter readings for maximum accuracy, but it's very easy to read in my mind. The same battery has been in here the whole time. And it has a little battery tester. I believe it is still, yeah, it's still pretty much at a very high capacity. I don't know if it's full or not, but this has been a very reliable meter. I hate the way it looks. I think it's ugly. It's plastic. It feels a little on the cheap side. It looks ridiculous on most cameras, but I will say it has held up well over the years, and it's very accurate. It's very reliable. The battery life is just really impressive. As ugly as I think it is, I do have to say this is a very good light meter, and they've come down in price a lot since I bought it, because I think I paid a little over $200 for this one, and I think now they're selling for a little over $100, so that's a price decrease that's pretty appealing right there. So if you're looking for a light meter that's reliable, I would probably say this is a pretty good one to go for. They're pretty easy to find, even though, you know, if you put it on a cool camera like a Nikon SP or a Leica M3 or something, it is going to look just stupid, but sometimes that's a small price you have to pay. So next up, I'm just going to drag in all these. These are all the Chinese light meters. So this is the TT Artisan's one that is kind of a copy of the Voigtlander VC2. I really like this one. I got it. It's solid metal. It's got a nice look. You got these 2 knobs here. You've got, you know, one right there for your shutter speeds up to 2000. Got a bunch of apertures, f22 down to f1. You got a little sub thing here where you can kind of set the film speed. And it goes, what is the max? 6,400 down to 25. So a pretty good range right there. Pretty useful, pretty flexible, I guess. But all that's kind of superficial and at a glance, because when you actually use this meter, and I know a couple of people have had this meter, a common problem seems to be that the shoe on the bottom, it's held in by 2 small screws, but when you move it around on the camera, it kind of starts to come loose, so you got to tighten the screws every once in a while. They do include a little screwdriver, but it's like, this is like a cheap little toy one you'd have with one of those like tech deck skateboards that were popular years and years ago. I found it a little hard to get the battery in and out. I mean, it wasn't impossible, but it wasn't great, because there's an additional screw here that holds the battery lid on, then you got to pop it off. The battery's in there. There's like a little spring thing you got to get in and kind of pop it out. So changing the battery was kind of hard. It did not include a battery, whereas the Syonic did include a battery, and they both use the same time. It's kind of a large battery. It's about the size of a coin, like a nickel or something. The last thing about this one is that the little diodes here that show the exposure. There's a center one that'll light up green that shows proper exposure, and then a plus and a minus that'll light up red to show if you're over or underexposed. Those ended up dying on me, so now this meter is pretty much useless. And I looked it up online, and this has happened to a couple other people, so I guess there are some reliability issues. I really love the look of this meter, and I love the way you can so easily just change you know, the shutter speed or the aperture, and it's all right on display right there. You can pretty quickly get like, you know, alternate exposures. It's a great idea, but the execution on this particular model is not so good. I would say go out and get the original Voigtlander VC2. That would be a pretty reasonable thing to say, but from what I can tell, it looks like they stopped making those meters. I think about, it must have been in probably like 2018 or maybe even 2017. And you can still find used ones out there, but you don't really see new ones. And even the new ones, I think, are kind of new old stock. So they're not going to be easy to find as time goes on. They're not very hard to find now, but they're going to get harder to find. They're not particularly cheap, and it seems like they're getting more expensive. So, you know, that's something to consider. There's another meter that looks very similar to this called a Domo or Dumo. It's very similar to this. I know the front little diode thing here is rounded instead of squared. And I think the shoes might be plastic instead of metal. And I think it comes with maybe multiple shoes. I don't know if I would trust those, because I imagine it's the same meter, just kind of slightly redesigned and rebranded. I know a lot of people like that one. But you know, when they first came out, I remember there being a lot of hoopla about them, and then everybody kind of stopped talking about them. So I would just be very careful of these sort of like Voigtlander knockoffs. It seems as though they have that kind of notorious made in China quality, where they're not necessarily the best quality, especially over time. They just don't hold up that well. On an opposite note there, I have these two meters, which are both also made in China. These are, what is it, V201X meters. They don't really have a name or manufacturer assigned to them. This one right here, it has kind of the aluminum metal finish, and it actually is made out of metal. It's not just a finish. The underside's plastic, but I've had this one now for 3 years or more, and it has held up very well. It has an internal battery that's charged by a USB-C cable. The batteries last for a long time on here. I think the meter readings are very accurate. The one issue I've had is sometimes in bright sunlight, it's a little hard to read the screens, but all in all, I think it's good. You might have to put a little tape on the bottom or something to kind of hold it on, because I've noticed in certain shoes on a lot of the cheaper and older cameras, they don't have the little spring pieces like more modern Nikons and, you know, some other cameras. They will kind of slide off, so you might want to be mindful of that. But that's probably not going to be an issue on too many cameras, but you know, it's a very incidental case-by-case kind of thing. I was kind of concerned that the little plate here might break off, the little shoe mount, because it's all, the bottom plate and the shoe mount are just one solid piece of like plastic, but they've held up well over the years. And the battery's held up very well. I've only had to recharge it maybe once every few months, so I've probably only recharged it like maybe 8 times or so, and all the time I've owned it. Now, I don't use it every single day, so it does get kind of more moderate usage, but it's held up very well. And so much so I went out and bought another one recently. I bought this one that's all black, kind of a plasticky or vinyl material. I don't really know, and it doesn't really matter that much. I thought the black would just, you know, look a little bit nicer, and it, you know, it's a little bit lighter. One really odd thing I found though is that it actually, when you turn the two on, they have very different sort of like firmware, because another complaint I had about this one is that there's no exposure compensator in it. You can't set anything if you don't like the exposures it's giving you, or you're in kind of unusual conditions with, like, you know, shooting over the ocean, you're getting a lot of reflections and you kind of want to push things, you know, up a stop. This one has that feature, but strangely it has a really weird feature where when you turn it on and off, it does not save any of the settings you've input like this one does. It resets everything to 0. So your ISO starts off at like 6, your aperture at 1. I forget what the shutter speed is at. I think it usually just kind of automatically calculates the shutter speed on the other ones. But if you want to do some other mode or different settings, you actually have to go in and manually reset everything every time you turn it on and off. Now, I have found there is a workaround. It goes to sleep after a minute or two. So if you don't turn it on and off with this little switch over here and just kind of let it go to sleep, you can just push this button and wake it back up, and you'll see that it kind of saved right there. It has ISO 400, it's at f14, and it shows about a 1/250th of a second shutter speed, which seems pretty reasonable right here. It will sometimes, as you're dialing through the aperture, it'll give you strange aperture readings sometimes, like f14, like you're seeing there, and like, what are some other ones? I know at one point it was giving me like, I want to say like f/26 and things like that are just weird aperture readings you're not going to find on most cameras. It does have like the standard like f/22, 16, 11, all that kind of stuff in there, but sometimes it'll just skip and give you these weird aperture readings that, like I said, just don't exist on most cameras, which is unusual, but I mean, it's not unworkable. That being said, I just found it very odd that these two, even though they look pretty much the same, their firmware seems to be so different. I don't really know why that is. I just assume that these are being made in China in like small plants and that there's not a lot of consistency because maybe they can't get consistent parts. Maybe it's different people building them and upgrading them kind of piecemeal and stuff like that. I don't know, but I would say this is one of those things where you probably don't want to spend a ton of money on these because you don't know exactly what you're getting. And I say that, I got this first one, I had a couple of complaints, but I mostly loved it. I got this new one. It addresses one of the big complaints, but it doesn't quite, address all of them. It would be interesting if they would release some sort of firmware model and you could kind of like custom program this. That's probably beyond my skill level, but if they could do that, I think this would be a much more popular style of meter, and it would be a lot more, I don't know if it would necessarily be approachable, because like I said, I don't know how many people are willing to go in there and kind of reprogram it, but it would have enough features, I think it would interest more people. And I know there's a lot of other light meters out there. People will point out those little, those super slim ones that have come out recently. I have a friend who has one of those, and he seemed to really like it, but I just didn't buy them. I've seen them around because they seem kind of expensive when I kind of figure they're not really that unique or impressive. They're just a pretty average light meter. I know there's some of the small, the really tiny ones like Ravini or something. I've seen those around, but from what I can tell, they just seem to be the same style of light meter, just kind of repackaged in a little 3D printed hood thing, kind of like this one actually, with some slightly different controls. I don't know if those actually have a screen on them or if they just use some sort of LEDs or something. I can't quite remember now. There's probably a couple of models out by now. But that's just some of my opinions on a few light meters I have. So just to reiterate, these are pretty good. I think I paid around 50 something for the silver one and like 33 for this black one. And if you can find a price like that and pick one of these up for $33, I would definitely suggest it. If they get up around that like $50, $60 price range, like they sometimes do, put a little more consideration into it. But I would definitely say it's not a bad idea to have one of these if you're on a budget, if you're looking for a backup light meter, especially one of the cheaper ones, because it's kind of hard to beat that price no matter what type of firmware and body hood thing you get. I think it's worth it, Syonic, that's an old one. It's reliable. It has some weird quirks. It just looks horrendous, and I know a lot of people probably aren't gonna buy it just because they are kind of old and ugly looking, but they get the job done, and they've gotten cheaper, so they're pretty approachable and findable. Maybe if you're lucky, you can pick up a used one for like 50 bucks. I don't know how likely that'll be, but if that happens, again, I'd say this is a pretty solid one. This one's neat, but again, I just don't know. If we're talking about old light meters, I have an old selenium meter I could grab over here. I just totally forgot about. But it's got like a little leather case, and it's got this chain thing, and you pop it open, and it's it works. It still works, but I never know with selenium meters how trustworthy they are. So if we get into every vintage meter out there, we'd be here all day, and I don't really have enough to make great comparisons. But there's plenty of good old meters out there you can buy that are pretty cheap and pretty resilient and durable, as you see with this one. As for the TT Artisan's meter, I'd have to say skip it. It looks really cool. When it comes to looks and like the controls and everything, this is exactly what I want. And I think this is what most people want. But at the same time, I just think that the build quality, especially the internal electronics, is questionable, and like the long-term survivability is pretty questionable. So I would have to say you're probably better off skipping these, especially when you consider that they're kind of moderately priced. They're usually over 60 bucks, which isn't bad, but you got to remember, you can get this one for 30. You can get this one for around 50. So if you're looking, if you're looking for something cheaper, you have big budget concerns, you got better answers right here. And like I said, at this point, you could probably find one of these Syonics for a little bit more money, but it also includes the battery, which is kind of nice, whereas this one did not include the battery, and I had to go out and buy a 2-pack, which cost me like $9 or something. So I mean, does that, you know, it's one of those things where I can't say that's, you know, a total justification for buying this one, but it's just another thing to consider that, you know, this one probably just isn't worth it. And not only is this one worth it, they give you the kind of bonus of the battery. I just think that's kind of nice. It's one of those small consumer focused things that'll make me, you know, look back at Syonic meters and be like, hey, you know what? I've got that one. It's pretty good. I might look at another one. And I know they have a lot of meters out there. They have some very high-end ones that have more of the little tunnel thing you look through. I can't think of what you call it now. But they have that kind of stuff and, you know, various like incident meters and everything. And I wouldn't mind picking one of those up. And it seems like prices have kind of come down over the past couple of years. Who knows how long that'll last for. But, you know, that's just kind of my 2 cents. There's plenty of light meters out there. You don't really have any excuse for not having one or two of them, but hopefully this will kind of give you some guidance if you're looking at light meters and you're just kind of overwhelmed and don't know what to buy, because as we've seen in the last couple of years, there's just a lot of these meters have come out from, you know, Kickstarter projects and small companies in China and stuff, and they're not all quite what you think they are. So do some research, and hopefully this video will facilitate that research or maybe help you make a final idea. And stay tuned for next time. I'll be back with some more other stuff that is, you know, hopefully a little bit more exciting than a pile of light meters.